Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is elephants, Africa's ecosystem engineers, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Lorraine Doyle. Lorraine, thank you so much for being here today. This looks like a fun topic. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Hey, thanks so much, Sunny. It's great to be back and doing some more webinars. So, yeah, hopefully this will be a topic that, that resonates with people. I think it's one of those topics that, in terms of animals, I think elephants are something that are pretty high on a lot of people's kind of radar when they go on safaris. So yeah, this is just a little bit of a delve into a little bit of their history and some of their unique factors, and then a little bit about their conservation and what their future looks like. So let's see if I can drive this. Let's see. Okay. Don't know why are we not going anywhere? Okay. So just for anyone who doesn't know me, this was me on a trip to the Kalahari recently. So then basically to start, strangely enough, at the beginning, please don't be alarmed by the slide that comes up next. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on it, because these sorts of cladograms, as we call them, often get people a little horrified. But it's really just to show the linkages, if you will, between elephants and other creatures that belong to this clade, which we call the Afrotheria. And the word actually comes from Latin, which Afro of Africa and Theria meaning wild beast. And these are really the living members which belong to groups that are either currently living in Africa or of African origin. This group was actually only really fully identified in the 1990s. We started looking much more closely at genetics rather than just fossil records, which gave us a slightly different insight into the origins of some animals and the relationships between them. And as I said, not to dwell too much on this, but if you look at the slide, you'll see that there's a red a line there which says Afrotheria, which then splits out, and in the top purple block you can see that you've actually got three orders there. So you've got your Sirenia, which are things like your manatees. Then you've got your elephants, and then your Hyracoidea are your things like hyraxes, which are a kind of they look a little bit like a rabbit. They're not a rabbit, but they look quite similar. And from this, all this is really telling us is that there are really close relationships between those three groups of creatures, and that they are more closely related to each other than other members of the rest of the Afrotheria. So there are many reasons why this happened, and that's kind of pretty much really a discussion for another day. But just to contextualize how far back we're going. So, we're looking at something that was happening about 105 to 90 million years ago. So this is just really kind of giving you a little bit more perhaps of the deep history of these creatures. So just one of the reasons that this essentially happened was because Africa was completely isolated by water until the time when Africa collided with India. And I mean, this is around the time of when the Himalayas got pushed up. And as a result of that period of isolation, you had what's known as convergent evolution. So things that perhaps had evolved in Africa were filling niches by things that had already been filled in places like Eurasia. And so as this progressed, and I'll just give you the next slide quickly, and again, please don't freak out, but all it is to show that for a long time we thought that there were really only two species of elephant, one Asian, one African. And then, so now if we look at the one that says the evolutionary tree based on DNA, you can see that the African elephant was then divided into two distinct species. So it was given the African savanna elephant and the African forest elephant. And so the one that now is the straight-tusked elephant, that was added to the mix fairly recently in terms of analysis. It's been extinct for 120,000 odd years. But a study of its DNA shows that it's actually the African forest elephant's closest relative. And so that's where you can see that blue Eurasian lineage coming in. And this whole process that happened when they started looking at this DNA changed how we looked at the relationships between elephants in terms of Asian elephants and African elephants, and even how mammoths, if you look at that link, mammoths were more closely related to Asian elephants than they are to African elephants, for example. So there is this really long history, and there were at one point many more species of elephant-like creatures which have, long since gone extinct. And the one that we'll look at this evening in a little more detail is the African savanna elephant, because in terms of African safaris, that's the elephant, that when people come certainly to Southern Africa, that's the elephant that we are likely to see. Just quickly looking at African versus Indian elephants. So the elephant with the large tusks is your African elephant. The one that's shown with the much, much smaller ears, and in this case, tusks that aren't present, is an Indian elephant. And so there are numerous differences between them. You can't actually see the tip of the trunk in either of these photographs, but African elephants actually have two finger-like projections at the end of their trunk. Indian elephants have only one. Ears much, much smaller. And in terms of size differential between males and females, male African elephants are generally about 23% taller than females, whereas Asian male elephants only about 15%. So the size differential, or what we call sexual dimorphism, is quite a lot less in African elephants. I don't have a picture of African forest elephants, but they're even considerably smaller again. So, but yeah, just a little bit of a difference between, as I say, African and Indian elephants. So I can't remember. I think it was when I was at university, I was told it's stats, damn stats and lies. But there are no lies in this. So this was just a little bit about elephants, just the kind of vital statistics, if you will. So the largest land mammal with an incredibly long lifespan for such a big creature. I mean, living between 60 and 70 years. Weighing in, and obviously these ranges are quite broad. So including females versus males, So obviously females at the lower end of the spectrum, males at the upper end of the spectrum. And also with this incredibly long gestation period of 22 months. A hefty 265 pounds when a little baby elephant is born. But when it is born, they are still, I mean, they are what we would call relatively precocial in that they are able to stand up quite soon after birth. But they do need a lot of and do receive a lot of care from other elephants for a number of years, even though they are relatively precocial at birth, unlike humans, which we would consider to be very altricial at birth, because we are completely incapable of looking after ourselves for the first few years of our life, which is not the case with elephants, but they still need a lot of parental care. Females reach sexual maturity younger than males. And even though males may reach sexual maturity at 14 to 15 years, they're probably not going to actually get to be able to breed until they're at least 25 or 30 years. Similar body temperatures to ours, incredibly slow respiration rates, 4 to 6 breaths per minute. We breathe on average 15 times per minute. And again, enormous heart beating relatively slowly. Again, compared to a human, our heart rate is going to be between 60 and 80 beats a minute at rest. Here you've got something that is looking at 25 to 35 beats. Again, quite a big range of numbers here when we look at how much food they eat per day, but it's a substantial portion of food. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is just now. And then also large quantities of water. So elephants are what we would consider water dependent animals. So they need to drink water every day and preferably multiple times during a day. So as opposed to animals, for example, that live in much more arid environments, like ant, which live up in more desert regions, they are adapted to not necessarily even need to drink free water, but able to get water from the vegetation on which they feed. So then I just want to look a little bit at some of the things that are just in the most standout things, if you will, about elephants. And then pretty much all of these photographs, apart from there's one or two schematic diagrams, which are not mine, but these photographs were all taken on safaris, natural habitat safaris, Secluded South Africa, in a number of the different venues that we go to. So here you can see a number of, well, there's two photos, one at the top, actually two bull elephants, quite rounded foreheads, which is typical of males. The female elephants have got much more angular heads. And this is just kind of looking at elephants' trunks. There's a few different actions, if you will, happening, especially on the bottom picture with their trunks. And it's literally one of a kind in terms of structures. So it gets used for social greetings. So that's really very much what's happening in the top one. Drinking, and in terms of sucking up liquid. So they don't per se drink through their trunks. Elephants use it as a giant straw, suck up the water, and then put the trunk into the mouth and then swallow the water. So they use it for feeding, breaking off branches, and it's also very much involved in their breathing. So it has no bony structure to it. There are just thousands upon thousands of muscles in it. So probably approximately 40,000 muscles in its trunk. So if we think about it perhaps in perspective, humans, you're looking at around 600 muscles in our entire body. Here you're looking at like 40,000 in just the trunk alone. So the trunk is more correctly called the proboscis, and it's actually a fusion of the nose and the upper lip. So elephants don't have an independent upper lip that has become fused to form this trunk-like, or this trunk, which enables them to use really as a tool as they go about their daily life. So this is just to show you. I mean, this again is an elephant using its trunk to scent the air with. So this is a young elephant, and it was scenting us. We were in a game drive vehicle not that far away from it, and it was scenting us and working out what it is that we were, what it is that we were. They have the most incredible sense of smell. It's been suggested that probably 4 times more sensitive than that of a bloodhound. And so developed is the sense that, completely unrelated to this, but in a project that was looking at whether puff adders, which are cryptic or stealth predators, whether they had an intrinsic smell, one of the animals that they used to see if they could detect it because of their incredible sense of smell were elephants. Interestingly, they couldn't. So the consensus is that these stealth predators that use crypsis, it makes no sense whatsoever to have a smell, because then predators will smell you. And if elephants can't smell you, then it's highly unlikely that pretty much anything else would be able to smell you. So they obviously use this to reach up as well. They'll use it as a tool to pull down branches. So they will put their trunk into deep pools, obviously to suck up water. And interestingly, as is the case with their tusks, they have a preference for whether when they're grasping something with their trunk, whether they twist it to the left or to the right. They similarly have a preference for tusks. They will use one tusk as what we call their master tusk. So they will either be right or left tusked, as humans are right or left-handed. So what elephants also do with their trunk, so this one is just showing them drinking at a waterhole. I think this was taken in Madikwe Game Reserve. They can suck up approximately 3 gallons of water each time an adult, I'm not talking about the younger ones, but adults, every time they suck up a trunk full of water, they're taking up approximately 3 gallons of water. They will sometimes spray water over their bodies to assist with cooling. So this is a young baby elephant, and for the first 3 months of its life, that elephant baby has got absolutely no control over its trunk whatsoever. So it's actually very entertaining to watch them, because they run around and this little trunk is swirling in front of them because they literally have no idea what to do with it. As time progresses, a little bit like a toddler learning to walk, it takes them approximately 2 years to gain full control of that trunk, to use it in the same way with the same level of dexterity as an adult. So they can use it, and you'll often watch these little babies. They will mimic what the adults are doing with their trunks. But in terms of full control, that takes a lot longer to develop. So as you can see in this picture here, elephant calves cannot suckle with their trunks. They have to suckle with their mouths. And so the trunk essentially gets bent out of the way because it has no ability to suck or utilize it at that point. And so it actually uses its mouth to suckle. So one of the other things, if we look at the trunk as it is involved in respiration, so inhaling air, elephants have got pretty uniquely adapted lungs. So they're actually connected to the rib cage via this fibrous tissue. And one of the things that elephants will also do with their trunk is they'll often use it as a snorkel. So if they're now in water, they require a lot of force in order to suck air in, and in having this attachment to the rib cage allows them to overcome this by an amount of additional force. And no other animal alive has this kind of specific structure. So it does beg the question, did they have some sort of ancestral connection to water? And this picture was taken on, I think, 2 safaris ago at Marataba. And as you can see, this elephant is very obviously swimming, and the trunk is being used completely as a snorkel, so that it's able to draw in air whilst it's swimming. So something that is integral or extremely important to their survival. Just to go back to this, so one of the things that sadly has happened in parts of Africa is with snaring, very often for meat poaching, elephants' trunks get caught in snares. And I've seen it particularly in places like Hwange Game Reserve in Zimbabwe. Elephants that have lost a section of their trunk because of snaring. And for many of them, provided it's not the greater percentage of the trunk that goes, they can still function, but it obviously makes life a lot more difficult for them because it is something that is used for so many multiple purposes. So this picture is a picture is an internet-based picture, and it really was just to demonstrate what elephant teeth look like. So elephants chew food for almost 20 hours of the day. You've got this huge body size. They have a very inefficient digestive tract. They're what we call hindgut fermenters. And so they spend a lot of time trying to get adequate nutrition from vegetation to support their enormous bulk. And so they have this incredible set of teeth. Each one of those big blocks is actually a tooth. So those are molars. And they actually have 6 sets of molars that they will work through in their lifetime. And what's very interesting about elephants is when you watch them feeding, if they're eating grass, for example, they will brush all the dirt off it. They'll knock it off before they'll put it in their mouth. And one of those reasons is because obviously if there is dirt or little bits of sand particles, and that then gets onto their teeth, that's going to grind down their teeth, or the enamel on the teeth, even quicker. And once an elephant has gone through its full 6 set of molars, it ultimately will starve to death. So the way that elephants' teeth work, the sets of molars don't actually all erupt at once. So what happens is on the surface of each of these molars, there are, you can see on the picture, these ridges, these transverse ridges. They're known as lamella. And as the elephant grows, a new lamella is produced at the back, from the back of the jaw, and attaches to the one in front of it. And so these are constantly growing and replacing ones at the front of the jaw, because those get ground down by excessive use. And yeah, it's pretty much like they've got this conveyor belt of teeth, which are constantly essentially being renewed. So the teeth that most people will be familiar with in elephants are their incisors, which are known as tusks. So tusks erupt in young elephants around 2.5 to 3 years of age. And it's one way of aging youngish elephants, because we know that if they've got tiny little tusks erupting, they're probably about 2.5 years old. Thereafter, tusks become very difficult to use as a gauge, because some elephants have very large tusks relatively young. Some have small tusks, even though they are much older. So it's not something that we can utilize really as an aging tool once they get over 2.5 to 3 years of age. So this was just a picture. So this elephant he was actually coming up the bank of the Sand River, and he decided to throw a bunch of vegetation and dust over himself while he was doing it. But this was just to show the tusks. And so the dentine on the tooth is what we know or call ivory. So there is a portion of that tusk which is obviously in the socket in the skull. So they use these for digging for water. Especially during the winter months, elephants use their tusks quite extensively for pulling bark off trees. Now, in terms of nutritive value, they're not actually trying to eat the bark itself, the woody matter. What they're looking for is the layer that lies just under the bark, which is known as the cambium layer. And that's where your xylem and phloem are, which deliver all your nutrient, or have all the nutrients in it, because that is what transports water and food for the plant. And elephants, and there are tuskless elephants, those elephants have a much harder time in winter, because if they don't have tusks, the ability to then debark trees is much more difficult. So males and females in African elephants have tusks, generally thicker and heavier in males than in females. So again, and this really sort of speaks in a little bit to conservation and issues that have happened surrounding elephants, is largely because of excessive hunting and poaching in the early parts of the 20th century. A lot of elephants were poached for or killed for their ivory, and unfortunately, as a result of that, the strong genes which coded for big tusks were removed from many populations, which has resulted now in elephants with smaller tusks. And in certain areas, it has definitely been a contributory factor to elephants with no tusks. If you go to places such as Mana Pools in Zimbabwe, there are populations of elephants there that have no tusks. And the best evidence for that is that it's linked directly to the amount of ivory poaching or hunting that went on in earlier parts of the 20th century. This was just to show this elephant's tusk, which is actually, you can see that it's broken off. And this is quite common because elephants, especially when they're eating grass, they pull grass repeatedly over that ivory for years and years and years. And eventually it weakens it. So you get something on the tusk known as a grass notch. And often that portion will then become weakened and break off. But again, if you're using this to dig with or to maneuver bark off a tree or even help push a tree over, that's expending a lot of strain on the tusk. And so it's not surprising that they do sometimes break off. And this is not an uncommon sight. So then, just to look at sort of other elements of elephants, so their ears, their skin, and their feet. So elephants have got absolutely incredible ears. So they generate a lot of internal heat. And as we'll talk about their skin just now, they actually don't have sweat glands. They've got very thick skin, can be up to 1 inch thick. And so their ability to lose heat as we do through evaporative cooling through sweat is not an option for them. And so what happens is they pump their blood through the network of veins, which you can see in the top photograph. They're pumping pretty much their entire circulatory system through those ears every 20 or 30 minutes. And when they flap their ears, they create this current of cool air above the ear. And that allows the elephant to radiate heat from those veins into the air. And then you can pump cool down blood back into your brain and your body. And so that is a very good way of basically allowing them to cool down, essentially functioning as something of a radiator. And I mean, even little ellies like this guy, even here you can see, even on the front of the ear, not so much evident as at the back, but you can see that there's significant venation and pretty thin skin compared to the rest of the body over the ears. So this was just looking at, so elephants will very often coat themselves in mud. And this is, again, a way of trying to cool themselves down. But if you have a look at all the mud that's encrusted on the eyelashes, elephants' eyes are protected by these incredibly long eyelashes, which stop them poking themselves in the eye with branches when they're sticking their head into trees. But also helps, as you can see here, the mud got all caked on the eyelashes, but actually avoided going into the eye. So this is a typical picture of elephants. They love having mud baths. And even relatively big elephants like this female will get down and, if not fully roll in the mud, will certainly wallow to a great extent. And they're really using this mud as a form of sunscreen because although their skin is very thick, it's actually quite sensitive. And so this helps with conserving moisture. It does help with evaporative cooling. Also helps them to an extent stop that skin from burning. So yeah, not an uncommon sight to see elephants having a great mud bath. Depending on the color of the mud, depends on the color that the elephant turns out. And So this photograph was taken at Madikwe, and there is a lot of Kalahari sand there, red Kalahari sand. And some of my photographic friends will tell me that my color balance is off when I show them pictures like this. It's not. The soil really is that red. And as a result, it turns anything that wallows in it, be that elephants or warthog or anything else, they turn this very obvious shade of red. So elephants will also, on occasion, they will suck up dust with their trunk and blow it over their body. And this also helps form something of a protective crust to help keep the moisture in. What elephants will also often do once that crust has dried, any parasites that are then stuck in there, which have now died, will then be rubbed. And that's when you see elephants rubbing themselves on trees. And you get this kind of smooth effect where elephants or other animals have constantly gone and rubbed this mud off themselves to rid themselves of parasites. And here's a little Ellie. As you can see, he's kind of got his back legs crossed there, and yeah, he's rubbing mud off that he's been wallowing in. So this is just another interesting part about elephants, is their feet. So very big front feet, round feet. And if you look at most quadrupeds, many of them will have much bigger front feet than back feet, because a lot of the weight of the head and the shoulders, and in the case of elephants, the tusks and the trunk, are all born in the front. So you need a much bigger surface area than you do at the back. And if you were to look at a drawing, however, of an elephant's foot, they almost are walking on their tippy toes. And underneath the heel of this foot, they have this cartilaginous fatty pad. And what happens is when the elephant puts down its foot, that fatty cushion absorbs the weight and expands. So, which is why when you look at an elephant's foot, it almost seems to like be squishing out. And that's pretty much because to an extent it is. And what's also interesting is as the weight gets rolled from the heel to the toe, that pad recoils like a spring, and that helps like help propel the elephant. So yeah, pretty interesting foot structure, quite different to most other animals. So this schematic diagram was just to show, if you look within an elephant, just how long the intestines are and how scrunched up they are within the elephant's body cavity. So yeah, that was just really for that purpose. And elephants, if you watch them feeding, they will take a branch in at one side of their mouth and they will roll it across those ridges on their molars. And in doing that, they're stripping off the bark, getting to that cambium layer, and then they spit out the rolled, once they've finished rolling it, they spit it out the other side. What's also interesting is elephants are born with what we would call sterile intestines. So they actually have to consume feces from the mother in order to get the bacterium necessary to digest vegetation. So they have a very, very inefficient digestive tract. Not necessarily the greatest example of elephant droppings. But if you take an elephant dropping and you break it open, it's full of undigested matter. So almost 60% of what goes in comes out undigested. And what happens is you'll then find creatures like these helmeted guinea fowl scratching around through elephant droppings in order to find the seeds and undigested fruits that maybe the elephant has eaten, as well as things like termites, which obviously will be there to break it down. But it's not uncommon to see these animals scratching through elephant droppings, picking out the undigested matter. So obviously elephants are highly social. And so this picture was taken at Malamala Game Reserve. And female elephants will spend their entire life in these matrilineal family groups. So elephants have a strong matriarchal society. She's often the oldest female, but not always. It just happens to be whichever is the most dominant female. And once you have a matriarch, she will remain in charge of that group until her death. And then very often it will be taken over by her eldest daughter. So a very important role, because it is this matriarch who knows where the water is, who knows the best food sources, and who has all of those skills which are essential to the rest of the herd. Adult males have a very different life. The males, as they mature, get pushed out of the main herd. Often you'll get groups of younger bulls hanging out together. Often find these big males trailing behind the big herds of elephants, waiting to see if there's a female for them to mate with. So much more solitary, only really, certainly once they get to full adulthood, only really associating with the herd when it's time for mating. So, as I said in the beginning, so you've got a gestation period of 22 months, and interbirth intervals are normally about 4 or 5 years. It's normally only ever a single youngster that is born. There have been rare records of twins. And elephants have an incredible interaction with their babies. When a calf is born, the herd will come around it. All of them have to touch it, caress it with their trunks. And elephants also practice what is known as alloparenting. So they are often cared for by someone other than their mother. So their sisters or aunties will be very involved in their rearing. So a lot of contact between mother and calf. So yeah, the calf will very frequently be close to mum, touching her. And you get a sense of just how tiny they are when you see them like this. Don't even really come up to mom's knee. This is an even younger one. It's quite sweet to see. You'll often see these tiny babies actually sucking on their trunk, almost like a baby sucking on a dummy. But this little one, you can see, still got its very early gray, very hairy, which is typical of tiny baby elephants. So again, this is just a close-up of a calf suckling. So for the first 3 months of its life, the calf is entirely dependent on milk from its mother. Thereafter, it starts to forage, picking up leaves and basically mimicking exactly what the adult's doing. So they will continue to suckle for a long period of time. And I mean, even up to 2 years to some extent. Often when you hear a lot of commotion amongst elephants, you'll hear this screaming. it's usually a little calf having an absolute tantrum and a meltdown because mom is now refusing to give it milk. Because you can imagine as the tusks start to erupt, this now becomes a rather uncomfortable process for mom. And the calf by that stage is more than capable of surviving on any browse or graze that it is eating, and so it doesn't need milk anymore. And so mom is not cooperative, and youngster gets very upset with this. So young elephants are very playful. This is two young males. They'll often tussle with each other. Again, pushing one another backwards and forwards. This is all learning skills that will be used in adulthood. This little one was playing with the bigger one, who's now showing that he's very big by putting out his ears. They love chasing things. Little elephants love chasing. This one was chasing birds, but often they'll run at things that are drinking at a waterhole just because they can. There's no ill intent. It's really just playfulness. This little one playing in the sand river, playing with water. But again, all of these play actions ultimately leading to some form of strengthening, whether it's of things like their trunk or skills that they will require for adult life. Just a very little bit on elephant communication. Elephant communication is incredibly complex, particularly their vocal communications. But this one is just really showing touching being a really important form of communication. Elephants will greet each other, they will wrap trunks, they'll stroke each other, they'll also mom and calf, there'll often be communication through touch. And it's interesting to watch elephant moms. They'll touch calves with their trunks or their feet when side by side, or often mom will flick her tail if the little one is behind her, touching to just reassure the calf that mom is there. And you can see here, this one, mom is not quite touching it with her tail, but you kind of get the concept. Obviously, elephants have this huge range of vocalizations that they can use, and they're also known to communicate with seismic vibrations. So they, again, this fatty pad that they have in the bottom of their feet, that also amplifies the seismic vibrations and allows them to pick them up over extremely long distances, up to even 10 or possibly even 20 miles through seismic vibration. And then really just lastly, thinking a little bit about the conservation of elephants. So I used the term ecosystem engineers in the title of the talk, and the reason for that is that elephants are instrumental in keeping savanna ecosystems open. So savanna ecosystems, which are highly productive because of their biodiversity, are a balance between woody trees and grasses. And to maintain that balance, elephants play a crucial role in pushing over trees, uprooting things, stopping woody trees encroaching into areas. They really only become destructive when elephant populations exceed what one would consider to be the carrying capacity of an area. And one of the biggest threats globally to conservation of any species is loss of habitat. And these are ongoing challenges from a conservation perspective that we need to consider. Obviously, elephants historically have also been subjected to poaching for ivory. In Southern Africa, that is much less of a challenge than it used to be. Our biggest challenge now is for our rhinos. But nonetheless, loss of habitat and potential what we call human-wildlife interaction, where elephants break out of reserves. Again, there is potential in those situations for conflict. So looking after these incredible creatures is not an easy task, but it's one that, I mean, we would have a much poorer world without having elephants in them. And you can imagine my surprise when you see this next slide. I walked around the corner to my room at Mala Mala, and that was standing outside my door. So thank you very much. And yeah, I hope you learned a little bit more about our ecosystem engineers. So back to you, Sunny.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And we've got some incredible questions. So we'll see how quickly we can get through them. Let's start with, does their sense of smell get even better as they age, or are they born with their full sense of smell?
So, I mean, in terms of the receptors that would be able to pick up scent, those are going to be, as they are in humans, those are present from birth. But obviously, as the animal gets subjected to many more different scents, then obviously their sense of smell will improve, because the breadth of scents that they are capable of picking up on will increase. And so, yeah, the intrinsic sense is there at the beginning, but it just develops over time so that they better interpret the environment around them.
Mm. With the evolution of tuskless elephants, do the babies still have any small tusks erupt to help age them? Sorry.
So, there are herds that I've seen now in mana pools where none of the elephants have tusks at all. So part of that, we think, as I said earlier, is potentially linked to genetics for bigger tusks being removed. But there also, particularly amongst female elephants, there seems to be some sort of genetic anomaly whereby they don't develop tusks. So you will have situations where there will be elephants that never develop tusks, and therefore, yeah, from that perspective, aging the youngsters becomes even more difficult.
Hmm. Can you talk a little more about their eyesight? How good is it, and can they see color?
So their eyesight is considered relatively good. So we believe that they can see color. It appears that they see better in slightly more dim light than very bright light. And they hate, for example, if you have a flashlight and you shine a flashlight on an elephant, they get very upset. So very bright light hurts their eyes. But they don't have the world's greatest eyesight. If you look at the size of their eyes in comparison to the rest of their body, they've got relatively small eyes. So their other senses, their sense of hearing, their sense of smell, are more developed than their eyesight. But so their eyesight is reasonable, but it's definitely not their strongest. It's not their strongest sense. They're going to have a much better sense of their environment through their sense of hearing and their sense of smell.
Hmm. Interesting. Is weight from pregnancy evenly distributed to front and rear feet, or is more carried by the larger front feet?
So I'm just going to see if I can just go back to this picture. Sorry, just give me a second here. It's actually not very well distributed at all. Of course, oh, there we go. Which way? No. Sorry. I lost the slide now. I have to get it. Where was it? Eh. So if you look at, so that actually shows you the 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 uterus with an elephant fetus. And it's actually kind of almost more distributed towards the back. And when these female elephants are pregnant, it almost looks, they kind of go out more, if you will, laterally. So rather than it becoming the abdomen becoming lower, the fetus kind of goes out more sideways. So I guess that helps distribute the weight a little more evenly, but it's not particularly well balanced. So, yeah.
Is there sometimes a fight or some other contest between female elephants when the matriarch dies?
No. Generally, it will go to her oldest daughter. So aggression amongst female elephants is pretty rare. Amongst male elephants, a lot more common, obviously, especially for mating rights. But because within a herd, all the females are related pretty much to each other, it doesn't, it's less of a challenge whether or not it's the eldest or the second eldest daughter who now takes over the matriarchal line, because the same genetics are still being passed on. And so I've never really seen any high aggression between female elephants. The same cannot be said for males. There's a lot more aggression amongst the males.
Since there's been so much poaching in certain areas, what happens when a young bull is not taught by the older males when the estrus cycle occurs?
That's a very good question. And one of the things that happened in the early years of translocating elephants from one place to another, when we didn't really understand how important it was for young male elephants to be taught how to behave, there was a situation that arose in a game reserve called Pilanesberg, where young bull elephants came into must, which is the state of heightened testosterone in time for breeding, way before they should have. So instead of only coming into must 17, 20 years, they were coming into must at like 10 years. And because they had no idea how to behave, they started trying to mate with rhinos, and they actually killed a number of rhino cows. And there was obviously a lot of consternation around this whole situation. And they had then found a way where they were able to translocate slightly bigger bulls, more dominant bulls. And what was incredible was within about 3 weeks of introducing a couple of big bulls, all the must had been suppressed in the young bulls and all the bad behavior had stopped. And so sadly, in situations where you might have an environment where you don't necessarily have older, more dominant bulls to control behavior, you do start to get aberrant behavior patterns arising. And so, yeah, which is very, very unfortunate. But certainly in conservation, where we do translocations, we've learned from those early experiences. And so, yeah, we try to mitigate for that. But if situations arise where that happens because of poaching, there is going to be aberrant behavior that occurs.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is the last question we have time for today. So I will turn it back to you for closing comments.
yeah, just to say, yeah, thank you very much for listening, and yeah, hopefully, like I said earlier, a little bit more information on these amazing animals. And yeah, have a good week.
Lorraine, thank you so much. I learned a ton, and from the comments and questions, which I will pass on to you, our viewers really appreciated your presentation today. So thank you again. I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, we'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.